By examining two episodes from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, this lecture focuses on what distinguishes Dostoevsky's view of human identity and the human search for meaning from Nietzsche's. In this way, our course takes its last step before we turn to an examination of the human search for meaning precisely within the context of the historical and cultural situation of the 20th century. In other words, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are the two optics which prepare us to examine more closely the experience of the search for meaning in our own times. In the Grand Inquisitor episode in The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky uses a parable to criticize the culture of contemporary Western Europe. His critique, in many ways, closely resembles Kierkegaard's, and, ironically, at the same time, Nietzsche's as well. But Dostoevsky's critique is precisely from the perspective of his specifically Russian Orthodox perspective on Christianity. In the episode in the novel entitled The Russian Monk, Dostoevsky's version of the saint is presented to us in radical terms, both in its return to the roots of faith in the stories of Abraham, Jesus, and Mohammed, and in its direct address to Nietzsche's critique of Western Christianity. Now, of course, we need to make a small clarification here because Nietzsche is subsequent to, obviously, in historical terms, the active period of Dostoevsky's career. It would be, in that sense, Nietzsche responding to Dostoevsky. However, we've reversed the chronological order here simply for a matter of emphasis. What I wanted to emphasize with regard to Nietzsche was how directly he brings to a kind of climax and a pinnacle of tension the movement of change and disturbance that we saw at work in Marx, Darwin, and Freud. And together, Nietzsche articulates that in terms of the figure of Zarathustra. Now we want to emphasize the way in which, at the same time, Nietzsche offers a radical case for the return of the hero, Dostoevsky simultaneously is offering a radical case for the return of the saint in this moment of crisis. The parable of the Grand Inquisitor and the figure of the Russian monk offer a path, Dostoevsky believes, in the human search for meaning which, although it is as compelling as Nietzsche's, heads in precisely the opposite direction. This lecture examines the implication, the significant and pointed implication of this paradoxical recognition. Dostoevsky, of course, one of Russia's greatest writers, was, along with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, a pioneer of the existentialist movement as we came to understand that in the 20th century. Amidst widespread political and social upheaval throughout Europe and the build-up to what eventually would erupt as the Bolshevik uprising, Dostoevsky probed the psychological and spiritual crisis which confronted the Russian people in the face of sweeping cultural changes stimulated by the influence of Western Europe. Dostoevsky's novels drew from aspects of his personal life, including his epilepsy, the extreme financial exigency due to addictive gambling, political exile, imprisonment, personal bereavement, professional rejection, religious conversion, and the recognition of the need for reform and renewal to preserve Russian identity despite its assimilation to Western European values. Dostoevsky struggled with these concerns, creatively transforming them into metaphors of Russian identity and of the universally human search for identity. In works such as Notes from the Underground in 1864, Crime and Punishment, 1866, The Gambler, 1867, The Idiot, The Possessed, and finally The Brothers Karamazov, which was not completed until shortly before his death in 1881. The Brothers Karamazov offers an effective metonymy, an image in part for the whole of Dostoevsky's literary vision. Father Zosima, the Russian monk in the novel, represents Dostoevsky's idealized vision of the saint that Russia needed at that moment. Thus, the Brothers Karamazov will play a role analogous to that of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in our treatment of Nietzsche. And the Russian monk parallels for Dostoevsky the role that Zarathustra played for Nietzsche. The Brothers Karamazov represents Dostoevsky's most direct attempt to confront the mysterious source of evil in the human heart, the active depravity and irresponsible acquiescence which that evil gives rise to, and also the resources available to human beings to resist it. We can analyze Dostoevsky's engagement with the human problem of evil in a decisive exchange between Ivan, the second of the three brothers, and his younger brother, Aloysia, Zosima's spiritual disciple. In Book 5, Ivan explains the bizarre vow he has taken to commit suicide in 6 years, symbolically at the age of 33. And this vow effectively summarizes Ivan's individualistic, rationalistic, and nihilistic tendencies, which Dostoevsky saw as representative of the corrupting effects of liberal European values on Russian culture. Ivan states his position this way. He says to Aloysia, "It's not that I don't accept God, you must understand. It's the world created by him I don't and cannot accept. Let me make it plain. I believe, like a child, that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, of all the blood they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened with men. But though all that may come to pass, I don't accept it. I won't accept it. Even if parallel lines do meet and I see it myself, I shall see it and say that they've met, but still I won't accept it. That's what's at the root of me, Aloysia. That's my creed." So, in this extraordinary statement, Ivan cites his atheistic rejection of God, not the fact of God, but the meaning of God, as responsible for the untenable predicament in which Ivan sees human existence as standing. We see that at the root of Ivan's problem is the scandal of innocent human suffering, the problem of evil, in other words, the problem of evil that's rooted in the malicious freedom of other human beings. No amount of divine forgiveness, no divine salvation, no divine reconciliation can make up for the fact that innocent human beings have suffered. That's what's unacceptable. to Ivan. In the second chapter of Book 5, Ivan tells Aloysia a parable entitled The Grand Inquisitor, to illustrate why he believes that Christianity has failed utterly to deal with the ultimate source of the problem of evil, the irresolvable ambivalence at the heart of human freedom. That, in a certain sense, Ivan says, God is irrelevant to that problem. Or, alternatively, God himself is the very source of that problem. The parable tells of a powerful 16th century Spanish Jesuit cardinal, the Grand Inquisitor, who was leader of the Inquisition in Seville. In the parable, Jesus returns to earth and performs a miracle in Seville, raising significantly a dead child to life. The cardinal has Jesus arrested for this public display, charging that rather than bringing salvation, Jesus has in the past and once again is placing on suffering humanity the additional and intolerable burden of freedom, and with freedom, responsibility for themselves. The Inquisitor says to the captive Jesus, "For the secret of man's being is not only to live, but to have something to live for. Without a stable conception of the object of life, man would not consent to go on living, and would rather destroy himself than remain on earth, though he had bread in abundance. This is true. But what happened? Instead of taking man's freedom from them, thou didst make it greater than ever. Didst thou forget that man prefers peace and even death to freedom of choice in the knowledge of good and evil? Nothing is more seductive for man than his freedom of control, but nothing is a greater cause of suffering. And behold, instead of giving a firm foundation for setting the conscience of man at rest forever, thou didst choose all that is exceptional, vague, and enigmatic. Thou didst choose what was utterly beyond the strength of men, acting as though thou didst not love them at all. Thou who didst come to give thy life for them, instead of taking possession of men's freedom, thou didst increase it and burden the spiritual kingdom of mankind with its sufferings forever." A classic statement, in other words, of what we've identified as the irreparable ambiguity at the heart of freedom. The human predicament seems to be either happiness, peace, contentment, or freedom and responsibility. But the two are mutually exclusive, and this is the position which Ivan represents and which he articulates through the figure of the Grand Inquisitor. In a very insightful essay, scholar Charles Guignon interprets this exchange as signifying, from Dostoevsky's point of view, the disastrous results of the Lutheran Reform and the Catholic Counter-Reformation for European Christianity. Let me explain that just a little further. According to Guignon, the cardinal represents Roman Catholicism and its emphasis on external works, absolving human beings of responsibility for their freedom, especially and specifically the freedom of conscience, and stupefying them in a paternalistic collectivity where only their leaders, like the cardinal, bear the burden of knowledge and of freedom. In the parable, the figure of Jesus is also a caricature, representing the pure interiority of individual faith, unmediated by communal structures of teaching and example that Dostoevsky saw as characteristic of Lutheran Protestantism. In other words, both these figures are caricatures of the realities, communal and individual, of true Christianity as Dostoevsky understood it. In contrast to this, Book 6 of the Brothers presents the story of Father Zosima, the Russian monk, who preaches the hidden meaning of love as revealed in the resurrection of Jesus, a love whose highest expression is, as we have seen, forgiveness. 2 episodes from Father Zosima's life suggest how he came to be the living incarnation of this truth of forgiveness, which, though revealed, remains a mystery, and which, in Dostoevsky's view, only the spirituality of the Russian people still preserves, sustained by the emphasis placed on mystery by their Orthodox faith. Father Zosima's story of the death of his brother when Zosima was still a child, his brother who died while himself still a young man, portrays the nature of his brother's conversion to the realization that only the spirit of forgiveness can save humanity from despair in the face of evil. This spirit of universal and unconditional forgiveness flows from the acceptance of the truth that, as Dostoevsky has his character put it, we are all responsible to all others and for all. Let's listen to the story of this first conversion, his Zosima's brother's conversion. In the midst of the brother's illness, from which he will soon die, the brother says to their mother, "Don't cry, mother," he would answer. "Life is paradise, and we are all in paradise. But we won't see it. If we would, we should have heaven on earth the next day." Mother shook her head as she listened. "My darling, it's your illness that makes you talk like that." "Mother, darling," he would say, "there must be servants and masters, but if so, I will be the servant of my servants, the same as they are to me. And another thing, mother, every one of us has sinned against all men, and I more than any." Mother positively smiled at that and smiled through her tears. "Why, how can you have sinned against all men? More than all. Robbers and murderers have done that, but what sin have you committed, yet that you hold yourself more guilty than all?" Mother, little heart of mine, my joy, believe me, everyone is really responsible to all men, for all men, and for everything. I don't know how to explain it to you, but I feel it is so, painfully even. And how is it that we went on then living, getting angry, and not knowing? Father Zosima's story of his own conversion, subsequent to the conversion of his brother, illustrates the experience of liberation that follows from the recognition and acknowledgement of one's need for forgiveness. I want to recount that story for you in its full detail, because here I'm convinced that as with Nietzsche, so too for Zarathustra, as for Nietzsche's Zarathustra, so too with Dostoevsky's Zosima. Their identity is in the texture of the way they express themselves. Deeds are important, yes, but there's a certain sensibility that comes through by the way they identify themselves through their stories. So, Zosima's own conversion. He's been challenged to a duel. He's a soldier. He's been involved in a conflict with another man over a woman. And having been challenged to a duel, he's accepted and goes home at night to await the next morning. We pick up the story at that point. Zosima says, "And then something happened that in very truth was the turning point of my life. In the evening, returning home in a savage and brutal humor, I flew into a rage with my orderly, Afanasi, and gave him 2 blows in the face with all my might, so that it was covered with blood. And believe me, though it's 40 years ago now, I recall it with the same shame and pain. I went to bed and slept for about 3 hours. When I waked the next morning, day was breaking. I got up, looked out over the garden. I saw the sun rising. It was warm and beautiful. The birds were singing. What's the meaning of it? I thought. I feel in my heart as if something were vile and shameful. And all at once, I knew what it was. It was because I had beaten Afanasi the evening before. It all rose before my mind. It all was repeated over again. He stood before me and I was beating him straight on the face. And he was holding his arms stiffly down, his head erect, his eyes fixed on me as though on parade. He staggered at every blow and did not even dare to raise his hands to protect himself. That is what a man has been brought to. And that was a man beating a fellow creature. What a crime. I hid my face in my hands and fell upon my bed and broke into a storm of tears. And then I remembered my brother Markel and what he had said on his deathbed to his servants. My dear ones, why do you wait on me? Why do you love me? Am I worth your waiting on me? Yes. Am I worth it? Flashed through my mind. After all, what am I worth that another man, a fellow creature, made in the image and likeness of God, should serve me? For the first time in my life, this question forced itself upon me. He had said, "Mother, my little heart, in truth we are each responsible to all and for all. It's only men that don't know this. If they knew it, the world would be a paradise at once." God, can that too be false? I thought as I wept. In truth, perhaps I am more than all others, responsible for all, a greater sinner than all men in the world. Nietzsche said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. This should lead us to wonder, given Nietzsche's general attitude toward other cultural figures, this should lead us to wonder what the harbinger of the death of God could find in Dostoevsky's Christian mysticism of forgiveness and redemption through suffering that would inform his own vision of the Overman. How can these two possibly go together? It's important, therefore, to recognize a hidden kinship between Dostoevsky's saint and Nietzsche's hero. Let me try to put it this way. Because each one pushes the inner logic of the worldview which he embodies to its furthest extreme, verging on its absolute limit. As a result of that, by being pushed to that extreme, in a sense, they come full circle and meet on common ground. To say, as Zosima does, that all are responsible to all, for all. He enunciates a view which, in strictly logical terms, is precisely and effectively equivalent to the overman's assertion that no one is responsible to anyone for anything. So rather than dismiss this startling outcome as some sort of semantic illusion, as some sort of trickery of the phrasing, I think it's important that we consider whether Dostoevsky and Nietzsche together, in the extremity of their opposition to one another, mystical theist, strident atheists, whether or not they do not together foresee, each from his own perspective, the necessity to acknowledge that the saint can never dispense with the hero, nor the hero with the saint. Neither is sufficient to stand on their own. Despite their irreconcilable differences, each one, hero and saint, absolutely needs the other in order to experience reality as a whole, truthfully. That is, to experience reality authentically as a question in the face of mystery, and as a way of life based on a commitment to live that question with full responsibility. As we turn in our lectures now to the 20th century and to the transformation which the human search for meaning undergoes in the 20th century, we will use, as I've already suggested, the figure of the secular saint to embody the realization that we've tried in these last two lectures to portray in terms of Nietzsche's relationship to Dostoevsky, the relationship of Zarathustra to Zosima, the relationship established by the reassertion of heroic identity in the face of the crisis which the Enlightenment and its aftermath produces. The reassertion of a worldview, a context for human existence, whether from the point of view of the notion of democratic liberal citizenship, where citizenship implies, as we have seen, equality, and that equality a certain kind of anonymity. All are exactly the same as all, whether it comes from the worldview of Darwinian evolutionary science, where human existence, like all other biological existence in the world, is simply a matter of the dynamics of natural selection and species adaptation, or Marx's view of capitalism and the struggle of socialism, where it is the impersonal forces of the economy that determine the meaning of human existence. And Nietzsche's assertion within that complex of the need to return to heroic identity, the identity that is at home in the impersonal reality which Western European culture had become. Or, on the other hand, Dostoevsky's response to that atheistic, secular, and impersonal reality which he so much identified with the culture of Western Europe of the Enlightenment, and in the face of which Dostoevsky, through Zosima, asserts the need for a radical return to the values of personalism, of covenant relationship, of the sacred bond between persons, the bond which is the very reality of personhood, and the assertion of that bond through the notion of responsibility. All are responsible to all, for all. Notice here And this is the primary point I would want to emphasize in concluding, because it will be our jumping off point in the next lecture for our discussion of the 20th century. All are responsible to all for all. No one is responsible to anyone for anything. The view of the self-mastering overman. Both are totalized views of reality. Both struggle with the necessity to come to terms with the reality of human existence as a whole. It's precisely in that attempt to reach totality, to reach wholeness, that they oppose one another, and it's precisely in that same opposition that they complement one another.